Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Because we'll be talking all day. Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Eric, it's a pleasure to have you back on, man. Let's talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm here for you.
Well, thanks for getting me back on so soon, Robbie. The first one must have gone down really well. I saw I got 9 likes, at least. Maybe more by now. I don't know. Yeah, you mentioned one thing we didn't really get to in the last one, because it was like pretty substance intensive, was Watergate. And the way that Watergate can be construed as a false flag operation. Now, one of the real pioneers in the field of parapolitics, I'm going to try to get over using conspiracy theory, because that carries with it too much luggage and people just start tuning out as soon as you mention the word anyway, right? So, but I was going to mention parapolitics instead of conspiracy theory. Is a guy called Carl Oglesby, who was actually big in leftist politics in the 1960s or 70s. And he wrote a very, very seminal book in the field of parapolitics and alternative theories of American history called the Yankee-Cowboy War. And the premise of that book, which I made a great use of in my own book on the false flag, which was published with Pumpkin Spectacle of the False Flag, is that basically the history of the United States ever since its inception, far more than establishing national independence, far more than fighting border wars with the British or with the Mexicans or with the Spanish or with native peoples, or maintaining slavery in the South and preventing unions in the North, trade unions in the North, is that basically the system is geared upon preventing a civil war. But the United States is radically regionalized, radically polarized, radically particularized, localized. And it does not really fit together very well as a fairly European-style unified state. And of course, then again, we have the constitutional guarantees of state rights in the Constitution. Of course, and this is a hot topic for the last 10 years or so, because the left broadly feels that if we want to make real social and cultural and political progress, we have to basically abolish state rights, get rid of the Senate, all that stuff. We can talk about that if you want, but that's not really germane with the main topic, which is this. The history of the United States is about preventing a civil war, preventing a secessionist breakup. And the system failed beginning in 1848. That was the irrepressible conflict, as it was called, because the vast influx of Western territories brought out into the open the northern Midwestern free labor versus the southern anti-free labor slavery political economies in direct conflict, and which one was going to dominate the national system. The system broke down, and there was a national holocaust in a lot of different ways, and then the system sort of got put back together again, in a very unsatisfactory manner. And what basically happened, according to Oglesby, is that there was a change in American political culture in which the elites, I'll just call them the elites, okay? I'll leave that underdefined for the moment. The elites decided that what we need to do is to engage in a de facto, not a de jure, not public, not above the table, but sub rosa, under the table, power sharing arrangement alternating between regional elites. And he called the northern eastern elite network the Yankees, and he called the southern western prairie Rocky Mountain states political network of elites the Cowboys. Each networks of elites corresponds to a different political economy: industrial versus agricultural, Atlanticist versus Pacific, Eastern-looking, Western-looking, conservative, expansionist, that sort of thing. And basically what he says is, if you look under the surface, dig a little bit deeper, what we have are these alternations between cowboy and Yankee factions, right? And that pretty much kept everything going, beginning with Reconstruction, kept pretty much in place till about 1914, which of course was the beginning of the First World War and the rise of the Wilson administration, which Theodore Roosevelt, notwithstanding, was the first robustly full-on hard drive progressivist regime in the United States. And under Wilson's very, very, very intensely Yankee-dominated government, the foundations of what eventually became known as the military-industrial complex were laid. And of course, then he double-crossed the American people by quite deliberately intentionally breaking his promise of non-intervention neutrality during the First World War. And the United States tried to enter into the Versailles Treaty and then began laying the groundwork for a peaceful transition of world hegemony from Britain towards the United States. So beginning in 1914 and certainly irreversibly established under Roosevelt too, beginning in 1941, the United States the national system became lopsidedly Yankee and became irredeemably Atlanticist in its outlook. And that, of course, caused tension with the cowboy factions, who were, first of all, not multilateralists. They were bilateralists or unilateralists in terms of international relations, and they were far more concerned with the Pacific and neo-colonial expansion into the Pacific Basin, beginning with the Philippines, and then maybe thinking farther abroad, for example, becoming the patron protector of Australia and New Zealand, which, of course, metamorphosized into the ANZUS strategic alliance, which is not really a big deal historically, except, of course, for if you're living in Australia or New Zealand. But it's become a hot topic now because it looks like the United States has decided to weaponize the ANZUS system. And, of course, the United States is fast-tracking 40 nuclear submarines to give to the Australian Navy to establish them in military bases in Darwin and other parts of the Northern Territory. Also, I think up around Brisbane or even farther north up the York Peninsula, I think into Cairns or Townsville, because basically they're using it as a forward launching base for hopefully a containable non-nuclear war with China, just as we have hopefully a containable non-nuclear war with Russia over a very unreliable proxy state known as the Ukraine. Okay, so basically what happened is World War I and World War II and the United States' successful transition to world hegemon pretty thoroughly displacing the United Kingdom, apart from the banking network and the intelligence network based in Westminster and London and the city. Apart from that, the United States was hegemon, but the trouble with U.S. hegemony is that it disrupts the domestic political equation, according to Oglesby. I'm running Oglesby, right? Between the competing Yankee and cowboy elites. The notion of, well, I'm not exactly what the right word to call it is, but shall we say reciprocal alteration. Yankee administration replaced by cowboy administration, Yankee interest counterbalanced by cowboy interest, one in, one out. The two-party system as basically fronts for contending regional-based political elites, right? Each with their own separate regional political cultures and regional political economies, right? So what happened is that with the rise of U.S. hegemony and then consolidated by Truman with, of course, the national security state, right? That's Harry's great accomplishment, right? Apart from dropping the bomb. Harry Truman's great accomplishment was to solidify American hegemony through the national security state, the CIA, the NSC, and all that stuff we talk about with them. We all know about anyway, broadly, even though we still don't actually know what's in the federal statute that authorizes the NSA, National Security Administration, because basically no one actually even knows what it does, but it's all there.
When we talk about, like, I know we like the word deep state gets thrown out a lot, but whenever I try to describe a deep state now, I kind of just point to the intelligence agencies. Like, we honestly don't know what they're doing at all. Like, I'm surprised there's not a film on the NSA. Like, that's the one I want to know the most about. Like, just through diving into the Kennedy assassination, I found documents that were really valuable in the NSA's archives. And I was like, what the hell? Like, we always point at the FBI and the CIA gets brought up all the time. I feel like that if you ask the general public, they're the ones that people are going to know most about. FBI's on film, CIA's on film, but the NSA is like this. And there's other agencies too. I think there's like 8.
Well, especially military intelligence agencies. I think that they are almost totally ignored. And not only military intelligence agencies that are deployed domestically. the U.S. Army and their intelligence apparatus is like Army intelligence, naval intelligence, Air Force intelligence, and then a number of intermediary organizations that sort of link and combine and work between official agencies. They seem to be domestically very active. And I think you're right. I don't really like the word deep state for a number of different reasons. And one reason why I don't like it is that when the term was developed in the 1930s, mainly by German constitutional jurists to try to give a constitution, express in constitutional form what the Third Reich was, because the Third Reich was this weird animal that sort of resisted formal legal analysis and classification, right? Lawyers are like scientists or taxonomists. They like classifying things. So when we say the word, we know what that means and then what flows from that. And the Third Reich is, in constitutional terms, very, very hard to conceptualize, to give it and express in the form of an equation, right? A formula. But the notion of the deep state, sometimes alternatively with the dual state, which is a term I like much better, although I don't like either term completely, is that there, and now we're going to Nazi Germany, okay? So this is a side conversation. You're going to have to bring me back on track. It's going to go off in tangents a lot, right? So the deep state or the dual state under Germanic Teutonic constitutional theory is the notion that as part of the executive operating de facto, not de jure, in actual fact, as opposed to formal legal principle, there is a collection of diplomats, foreign service operatives, military and intelligence personnel who mediate public domain and international relations. For example, Germany needed to rearm. There's no way they were going to suffer the side treaty in its entirety, right? So they were covertly planning on rearming. They needed to do it somehow, but they couldn't do it anywhere in Germany because the French were just basically totally invasive. They were demanding all these proofs that no rearmament was going on. So the Germans utilized the deep state to make a backrooms deal with Russia, of all people, the Russians, to allow the building of German military, especially Air Force bases, so that they could reconstruct the Air Force deep inside Belarus or Ukrainian territory, outside of French prying eyes, right? And that was like what we would call a deep state or a dual state operation. And that's when the dual state or deep state activated. When foreign policy, sometimes military, especially foreign policy demands what the state has to do to survive under the doctrine of raison d'etat, reason of the state, is incompatible with the operations or the ideological biases of the official public political regime, then the state will undertake sort of like backdoor operations to achieve the foreign policy results that are necessary for national purposes that are not digestible or conceivable or possible, could not be productively handled within the official political system. So that's the original meaning of the deep state. The problem with using the deep state today, if you don't remember the historical and constitutional and legal background and historical background of this, it sounds like the great bugaboo of conspiracy theory, isn't it? The secret government, right? The one world monolithic cabal that controls everything. And that's not really at all historically what we're talking about. And that isn't what Ogilvy is talking about in the
But it is
Yankee-Cowboy.
real, though. It is real.
Well, I'll leave it open whether it's real or not. But what I do agree with you is that you want to use a shorthand and avoid the unnecessary alienation that will follow whenever you use the word deep state. Just say national security apparatus or national security complex.
What about military industrial complex?
That's become a bit pejorative, but I mean I think that's better than deep state.
Can I say Epstein's Black Book? Does that count?
Actually, the new theory now isn't that he was murdered, but they basically encouraged him to commit suicide.
I get it.
They sort of talked him into committing harikari, right? In his prison cell. So, but I'll let that one go either because we simply don't know enough yet.
There's a lot. Like I had Nick Bryan on, and Nick Bryan's done exclusive work on that, like the Franklin scandal and stuff. But there's I mean, you see political suicides all the time that happen. Someone takes a pill or takes something, and people try and rush over and do that. Whether that is, I think there's a popular account. I can't remember his name though. He was a very popular guy that I think he tried to shoot himself or something in the middle of a courtroom, and he got arrested. Seems Barry, I think, something. It'll come to me probably after we get done this podcast. But someone told me to look it up, and I started looking it up, and it was a guy that tried to do what we've seen before, where someone takes a pill or takes a drink or takes something in the live courtroom proceeding. I think there's a popular video out there everyone can go watch. And it's like, I mean, the story behind this guy was that they gave him like amphetamines or they gave him something, and he was already a cokehead, basically. He was a political cokehead. And they kind of just gave him more of it and then just gave him like the tools to be able to create the craft. And whether you're doing political career suicide, you're doing literal suicide, those are actual things that have happened in our history. We know about them. We can bring up examples all the times of things that we can't explain why things happen. And so we get a conclusion, I would say, that necessarily nobody agrees with. Nobody, I think, believes Epstein committed suicide, but a lot of, I mean, even the people that want to believe it's probably because they don't want to know what the real thing of that is. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell got arrested and sent to prison from trafficking kids to no one, which doesn't make any sense, but we accept it because people don't want to look into it because they don't want to
know. That thing you're talking about, the post, that wasn't Gary Webb you're thinking.
No.
Okay, because I know he had problems like that. I didn't know what you were, because I don't know what you were talking about, but it sounded vaguely like the Gary Webb fiasco.
When in doubt, search Google. No, it should still be in my recent search. And then, of course, we have dead air.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I'll go back to Oglesby while you're googling. So the thing is that we've got certainly by 45, certainly by 47. We've got the American version of the Germanic deep state in the sense that I originally meant it, and then it just began anesthetizing and growing ever since, because of the military budget and America's hegemonic functions began proliferating along with a lot of other things. So, but what that basically meant was that the peace, the approximate peace, the functional peace between the Yankee and Cowboy factions, or factions of factions, the competing networks of factions, began to break down. And that led to a somewhat paranoid reaction within the Cowboy groupings that the deal had been broken and that the country was becoming irreversibly Atlanticist, pro-NATO, pro-EU, or pro-Europe, and was just simply the mastering system.
I'm not going to be able to find it.
That's right. And basically, the Cowboys felt that it was a breach of protocol, if not actually a breaking of the implicit agreement we've had in place since 1865, or certainly since Reconstruction began in 1876. Sorry, when Reconstruction ended in 1876. So the way that Oglesby frames it is that the reason why the United States became involved in Vietnam to the extent that it did was that it was a way of the Cowboys reclaiming part of their Pacific First agenda to reestablish the domestic equilibrium between the Cowboy and Yankee factions within the American. And the problem that the Cowboys had in 1960 was that they had probably the most pro-Yankee Atlanticist president in American history, which of course was John F. Kennedy. Right. And Oglesby basically, okay, it's a little bit complicated, but don't argue with me. I'm just going to tell you what Oglesby said, and then you can critique it later. So this is just to get it out. Kennedy knows that there's this Atlantic Cowboy cooperative system in place, and he knows that it's tilting Yankee in a way that is never done before, right? Again, following on from the Second World War. So what he decides to do is give everybody half of what they wanted. And when you've got two people at each other's throats and you give fighting over the same thing and you give each one half, what have you got? You've got two problems, not one, right? Because neither is satisfied. So what he decided to do was to appease the Cowboys. He authorizes the invasion of Cuba. Right, because one part of the Cowboy agenda is direct penetration into the Caribbean and Central America. Right? They're hemispheric, not global, apart from the Pacific Basin. And of course, that alienates both, because one, the whole thing was a complete disaster, the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs, and then the failure to follow through after the missile crisis. So totally alienated the Cowboys, and then the Yankees weren't very happy about it either, because it wasn't supposed to happen in the first place, because the idea was a kind of an embryonic detente system to be established with the Soviet Union to guarantee this peace and stability of Central Europe. Okay, so he alienated both sides. So that failed. So what does he do? Well, there's a quote I came across from JFK, but I verified it, and I talked to a couple of other people who are experts, and they said he definitely said it. And he made a comment about Cuba about 1962, 1963, but it was in discussion to the beginnings of the increase, the noticeable increase. I mean, nothing like under Johnson, but the beginnings of a noticeable increase of a direct military intervention in South Indochina. And he said, if it hadn't been for Cuba, we would be in Laos right now. Which doesn't make a lot of sense if you think that geopolitics follows rational lines of calculation, but it makes a great deal of sense if you're looking at it from the position of the American deep state in the sense that I've defined it, and in American politics, right? In other words, I've got to give both sides something, right? And if we couldn't do it in Cuba, then we're just going to have to do it in Laos. On the other hand, reverse it. If Indochina looks like a loser, which it certainly was as early as 1961, MacArthur said straight out, don't do, not a full-scale land war, naval blockade, maybe, Air Force campaign, maybe, but not a whole full-on military intervention. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Maxwell Taylor also started out the same way before he got corrupted and flip side became a huge Kennedy supporter, okay? But most of the fairly reasonably honest military executives were very much against a full-scale land intervention. Anyway.
Well, even if you know about Greg Polgrain's book about Indonesia, he found out that Allen Dulles and JFK had issues because Allen Dulles was so involved into the gold mine in Indonesia. Allen Dulles is connected to that Rockefeller family. So, I mean, if you look from like a deep state or certain political figures that would be very, very connected and kind of trying to move things on the chessboard to make sure they get the most profit. I mean, that's clear example is Indonesia. And even Dag Hammarskjöld death, I think just recently is getting looked back into based on the Patrice Lumumba issue that the church committee found out about when it comes to Allen Dulles. I mean, Dag Hammarskjöld's death goes down in a plane crash, and now they're looking back into that as well, too, to see if there is any notes of Allen Dulles that did that. I mean, that's the crazy thing is like people don't want to think like, hey, he worked for the government. He went down in a plane crash. The government didn't kill him. He worked for the government. I was like, look, man, depending on what faction you stand on and what views you had, I mean, Kennedy, to your point as well, too, Kennedy just seemed like what he did ushered in a new era of thinking for America.
Yeah, and again, I'm only talking about Oglesby. Okay, I mean, there's lots of different ways of looking at it, okay? But I'm just going with Oglesby because he's the guy I followed when I wrote my own book, which is kind of what we're talking about here by extension. Basically, we're getting to why was Watergate a false flag, right? Okay, so that Oglesby, and that's why Kennedy JFK is so pivotal here, is because he's the Yankee president that sort of broke the implicit agreement between the Yankee and Cowboy factions. That's basically it. So he tried to give him Cuba, that failed. He said, okay, we're going to have to go in Vietnam now. All right. So I try to give him, try to work out something. I made both sides unhappy. So what we'll do is I'll give the Cowboys Vietnam because I blew it in Cuba. But of course, sort of pissed off the Atlanticists, right? Was supposed to be, now that he's being way too Cowboy friendly, when he should be a dyed-in-the-wool Atlanticist Yankee type, which was actually his inclination. Again, according to Oglesby, right? So basically, because he was now engaged in Vietnam, the Cowboys were looking to this as their guarantee for among whatever profit motive there is, whatever federal government military contract profit element there is, they were looking towards it as a means of reestablishing the political equilibrium with Washington, right? Between the factions.
Political equilibrium between Washington.
within Washington
Okay.
between the factions, right?
Sorry, your mic.
Cowboy. Oh, I'm sorry. Cowboy and Cowboy. Sorry, Cowboy and Yankee, right? Sorry for that. Cowboy and Yankee. But then the problem is Vietnam becomes a disaster, and then Kennedy may or may not have been seriously contemplating pulling out. Right? That's the big that's the Stone hypothesis, the Oliver Stone hypothesis. Right? He was about to leave, and they decided to preempt the overly hasty departure. Plus, as David Talbot and a number of others have done, fairly convincing circumstantial evidence that Kennedy was trying to establish a series of backdoor channels with Russia, possibly Cuba as well, possibly maybe even Vietnam, and trying to go into kind of, again, the Atlanticist dream of a proto-detentist system. Right. Now, I'm going to speak out of sequence here a little bit, but it'll make it a little bit clearer. From your history of American politics in the 1960s and 70s, of all of the major public figures that we know about, the general media figures in the United States, who was the one during this period from about 1960 to 1976, probably the most hated within the conservative branch of the Republican Party? Conservative media, conservative pulpits, pundits, whatever it is, who was probably the single most unpopular figure among the American right?
Woody Harrelson's dad.
Apart from him,
Damn it. That was my only guess.
Henry Kissinger. Right? Henry Kissinger is despised. Why? What was Kissinger's greatest accomplishment? Apart from maybe keeping Nixon from sort of accidentally on purpose starting World War III, what was Kissinger's greatest accomplishment? Detente. And detente is Atlanticist to its core. It is about the most, in terms of foreign policy and defense policy, it's probably the most anti-cowboy thing you can do, is detente. And Kissinger was hated, and that's why many people felt that Nixon was more than a traitor. But I'm going to get into Watergate separately, okay? So the fact that there was, whether it is true or false, and Talbot, like a lot of American liberal academics, just loves the Kennedys to death, even though they were seriously corrupt. You're talking about Epstein, right? When it, or Trump's mini disaster, micro disasters. When we're talking about ingrained sexual perversity, the Kennedy brothers pretty much take the cake, including old man Kennedy, who was like a monster when it came to sex and women. Okay, so I shed no tears for him at all whatsoever on that front, at least. But the perception is that Kennedy is left looking for a hero after this, right? If not, but for the fact that JFK got whacked in Dallas, the country would be a much, much, much better place. Not, but anyway, that's their dogma. So the perception was that, even if it's a perception, was that Kennedy was looking to pull out of Vietnam and make something, gestures towards Russia and Cuba, at least, that we can see within that what was feared and what they may have been trying up to a point of a proto-embryonic version of detente, as Kissinger and Nixon finalized it after 1973, right? Therefore, Kennedy kind of had to go. And that's, in a nutshell, Oglesby explanation for the Kennedy assassination in Dallas in November 1963. He has no real theory about the mechanics of the assassination, only the motive. It was basically alienated cowboy factions within the national security state complex in cahoots. He doesn't like the mafia theory so much. He's into the Cuban and mercenary hypothesis, which I think is actually much stronger personally, but that's just me, to explain what happened. But if we look at it on in terms that, so he's only talking about motive, but if we're going to talk about mechanics, then I think the best way, or I'll put it this way, the least implausible way of framing a conspiratorial action in Dallas, meaning something more than just the lone nut shooter thing, right? Which was Lee Harvey Oswald has always been sold to us. if we are prepared to concede the possibility of conspiratorial action in Dallas, then what form would that conspiratorial action have taken? And the most likely or least implausible model would have been a false flag, right? Frame Oswald as a Soviet or Cuban agent that assassinated Kennedy on the orders or on the perceived orders of either Moscow or Havana. And then we would use that public outrage to create the irresistible political urge or impulse to invade Cuba, get it back, and then undercut all of the proto-detentist undertakings the Kennedy brothers have been trying to pull off, right? I hate JFK, the film. Okay, I really do. And I do not like Oliver Stone at all. But the worst part of it, to me, the greatest intellectual crime of the entire thing was that at one point he has Kevin Costner channeling Jim Garrison, going on about don't get hung up. And actually, he has Donald Sutherland's Colonel X, right, saying the same thing at different times. Don't get hung up in the mechanics of it. Don't get hung up in the shooting. The how and the what and the who and the where don't matter. The only thing that matters is the why. And I think that's completely backwards. As a matter of fact, it's catastrophically ass backwards. I think the how matters very much if we're going to go down the deep state line on Dallas, right? Because the whole thing has the feel and the fingerprints and the outlines and the shadows and the images and the contours of a frame. Why put so much emphasis on trying to frame this shooter this way, if not but for the fact that you want him to be perceived this way? And what would be the rationale for perceiving him this way? Well, it would be to sabotage the Kennedy political agenda and force a military crisis with Cuba to settle the issue that was botched both in 61 and in 62, Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. Get Cuba back. And at the same time, totally shut down all the back channels with Cuba and Russia. Therefore, the how it was done, and again, we're working on the assumption that there was a conspiracy. Okay, I'm going to leave the door open if there was or was not. We're working on the assumption that there was for our conversation, right? The how becomes very important. It has to be seen as Oswald has to be not just a lone nut, he has to be an agent provocateur, which is quite different from being a lone nut. I mean, he can be both things. You can be an agent provocateur and hopelessly insane, but he definitely has to be an agent provocateur at the very least. And when we look at the first, remember we were talking about the cover-up, you have to separate the cover-up from the conspiracy part of it. Otherwise, things just become hopelessly muddled. When we look at, and that way that I define it, right, everyone running for cover, either with foreknowledge or simply after the fact, trying to cover their own asses. If we look at one of the things that the cover-up did almost immediately, what was the first thing that FBI, Hoover, all those guys, Nicholas Katzenbach settled on well before all of the evidence was in? What was the first words out of almost everybody's mouth? Lone gunman. They had no idea. No one within 24 hours was in a position to know with certainty that there was a lone gun. And if you're conducting a proper criminal investigation, you will not rule out the possibility of accomplice of some kind. Getaway driver, someone exerting a degree of political or mental control over Oswald to get him to do what you want him to do. I mean, there are lots of possibilities. And remember, a conspiracy simply means people in the criminal sense. A second person who was egging him on, let's say hypothetically George Morgenstern, right? That's all you need. So why this rush to, as Mark Lane famously put it, rush to judgment? Why even if he was the lone gunman, why the rush to judgment? Well, we know the answer. Hoover said it, Katzenbach said it, Lyndon Johnson even said it later, maybe in kind of bad faith, but he said it. He said, we got to shut this thing down now so that it doesn't evolve into a full-blown political crisis. that would force us to do something about Castro, like taking him out.
Johnson said
Yes.
privately that he believed that Oswald didn't act alone, but he acted with maybe some Cuban exiles or some such
I
thing.
I think really I've always felt that the two groups that are the most interest are of the most interest that receive the least amount of attention are the Cuban exile community, and even more the American mercenaries embedded within the Cuban exile community. Okay, that's my own take on it. Right? I mean, if you're going to look for something like a smoking gun, those are the people to look at more than, I mean, anyone in the CIA or the the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or Lyndon Johnson. The way that Stone sets it up in the film. I mean, Lyndon is basically implicitly authorizing the hit through some of those very misleading flashback sequence. I mean, they look great on film. It's a fantastic looking and sounding film, but it is really hopelessly biased. So
I'm
irredeemably
not so
biased.
worried about the who. I'm more worried about like what can I prove that is wrong, and that is the fact that there obviously was a cover up. There was a lot of statements and there was a lot of things that should have been thoroughly looked through and that weren't. And you could say that's bad police work, but there's also lies that were committed. I mean, the Warren Commission stated that Jack Ruby had no Dallas police connections, and that's a damn lie. I mean, Jack Ruby wasn't stalking Oswald. We have photos to show that. So whether it's, I doubt you're going to get a person's, and I just spoke to Larry Schnapp, who's a part of that new JFK bill that they're passing right now about these release of this records. And he mentioned, he goes, the dangers of waiting till everyone's dead that's involved in these documents is recently they had a guy, I think in 2017, that passed away who was, his name was on one of these documents, but it limits the researchers from asking that person a certain amount of questions or just prying into things, who've done great work on the whole thing. So what I even included in there, I just told them, put in your bill that this whole declassification, national security issues, you need to start labeling what your terms are. I mean, if you see someone that's handed a rifle and they're asked to work on a rifle, and then the next day, like FBI, for instance, best example, they took 200 something pieces of evidence, or they took a large amount of evidence that was Oswald's, and then the next day they had it for a full night. They returned it and it was more than what they took out. So they
Good.
added evidence in.
Yeah. I think that the best way to proceed, because see, this is the thing. If there was a conspiracy of the sort of thing that we're talking about here, right? Regardless of what can be proved or what cannot,
Let's call
there
it
will be
tomfoolery. Call it tomfoolery.
tomfoolery. The tomfoolery will leave no paper traces, not as of up to the moment of the shooting. Afterwards, that's a different story, because, like I said, there are lots of different cover-ups about lots of different things being done by lots of different people, different times, in different places, for different reasons. And you cannot really impose a universal explanatory framework upon all that stuff. You can't. Okay, it's simply too complex, too diverse, and too contradictory in a lot of ways. But I think that if you, as a researcher and as an archive animal and a wannabe heroic journalist and all that stuff, you're looking at it and you cannot really realistically resist. We were talking about this last time too, about the ego of the conspiracy theorist researcher, cannot resist the temptation to try to come up with at least a unifying theory about everything. Then everything that we know with a pretty good degree of confidence about the diverse cover-ups after Dallas, the one thing that they all do seem to have in common is trying to establish Oswald as acting alone. Other things are involved as well. I'm not denying that. But I think the feel you get, the intuition that you have, is that it's all pointing back to him. And why is he so important? Because if it was a cowboy operation to get Cuba back, staged as a false flag to incriminate Castro and or the Russians in something like this, of this magnitude, then the surest way of shutting it down, short-circuiting, is to make sure that Oswald acted alone. So I guess my theory, and I'm following Oglesby very broadly here, again, speculating about the possibility of a conspiracy, is that the false flag is the most likely explanation for a theory. A false flag operation makes the how very important, because it's got to be done in such a way that one man is singled out and fingered for it. And, and that the reaction, the insistence upon him acting alone makes sense if people are aware that the point of the operation was to make it look like that Oswald was part of a Soviet-Cuban conspiracy. That, to me, if there's going to be a safety rope, you know, somebody goes before you in the woods and they leave the breadcrumbs behind you, right, to follow, to get through the dark woods. If there's something like that and all that, it's the emphasis upon either factually and certainly legally improperly establishing Oswald as lone gunman, because it explains both things. It explains the way it may have been set up by the conspirators, and it explains the way the story was managed by the anti-conspirators, the guys who were trying to shut down what the conspiracy, if it had succeeded, would have meant, which would have meant, in the worst case scenario, an invasion of Cuba, a full-scale invasion of Cuba, which takes us right back to October 16th, which is where no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but Curtis LeMay wouldn't have minded, but a lot of people didn't want to go. Okay, so that, now again, that's Ogilvy's story, right? So continuing with Ogilvy's work, what does this have to do with Watergate, which is what we're talking about, right? Let's just talk about Watergate. We're talking about JFK for the last hour, which is okay, because we're talking about Oglesby theory, the Yankee-Cowboy War. So basically, the way it works within his notion of the American deep state, which are these contending and hopefully manageable networks of factions, one collective Atlanticist Yankee, the other half Central America, Pacific Basin, Western-oriented, anti-multilateral cowboys, is that when JFK got killed, the Cowboys got to win. Right. Basically, killing him makes much more sense if you're a cowboy. This is, again, Ogilvy's theory, right? Killing Kennedy makes much more sense from a cowboy perspective than it does a Yankee perspective. Because Yankees like multilateralism, they like NATO, and they wanted something that eventually became detente, right? Okay. So Ogilvy says, not me, I'm just telling you what Ogilvy says, said that, all right, so if the Cowboys had to take this extreme action to try to restore the domestic parapolitical balance between competing Yankee and Cowboy factions, going so far as to actually kill the president, directly or indirectly, then what would the Yankees then have to do in response? They would have to take down a cowboy president. Now they can't take down Johnson because Johnson
out Nixon. Holy
yes,
shit.
yes, they took down Nixon. That's Ogilvy's theory. That's the big reveal. They took down the Yankee factions, took down Nixon. The counterbalance, the Cowboy counterbalancing from the Cowboy perspective of taking down Kennedy.
It's a stretch, but it fits. It fits.
No, there's a weird again, this is what I mean. I don't like deep state, okay? But parapolitical dual state national security complex logic to it, right? Who was the greatest? If Kennedy was probably the greatest Yankee Atlanticist president, although a very, very incompetent, half-assed one. I mean, to me, of all the U.S. presidents, the one that is by far most ridiculously overestimated is JFK. Okay, but within that time frame between, let's say, FDR to Reagan, who was like when the Cowboys really got it back, and they took the country back. Who was the greatest cowboy national politician? Well, one, of course, was Barry Goldwater, but he was unelectable. Okay. So Goldwater is unelectable. So next to Goldwater, who is the most dangerous of all the cowboy candidates for the presidency? Nixon.
I mean, it makes sense. I talked to Jeff Shepard, and he had a different perspective than a lot of people do throughout history. When it comes to Watergate, he obviously defended Nixon in the trial that he had at Watergate. But I think, I mean, if you read Watergate, you really look at it from like if they're targeting somebody, it seems like they're definitely all going and targeting him. a little bit as well too. I don't think he would have been right to stay in position of power. Don't get me wrong in that
No, no,
same
no.
aspect.
Don't worry. Your leftist credentials are fine. It's like there are two guys
I'm
in
deep state,
American
bro.
history, presidential history, that we have to make sure that you're letting everybody know that you're really a nice person. The two things you got to get out of your mouth immediately are, I hate Nixon, I hate Trump. Okay, you just can't have a conversation without denouncing them as a means of proving your credentials and then going on to talk about what you want to talk about.
It's fair that I hate them all, but I will say one thing.
You hate some more than others, yeah.
The Biden administration did see one thing that Trump's administration did have that was good, and that was the way we did handle the CCP. A lot of our relations with China and things that were going on. Now, they did leave it out with recently because of the spy balloon and things of that sort, but that's a whole different discussion. I know a lot about the CCP. We could have a field day with that one day.
So let me just get back on.
Yeah. So Nixon was screwing everybody over.
Well, I'll summarize it this way. What the nature of the Watergate false flag, or the false flag that Watergate is down. Christopher Hitchens pointed this out. I'm not really a fan of Christopher Hitchens, but
the guy who made Winnie the Pooh,
the guy who made the Iraq War happen. You know, what is Libby? What's his name? Libby, George Bush's legal counselor guy. Anyway, he became a total neocon and a war hawk over Iraq because basically he was terrified of Islamo-fascism, which was just an invention of his own semi-educated mind. But he was a clever guy in the way that the British are clever. And he said once, but he pointed out something very profound about Watergate. He said the Watergate, and he's talking about Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers and all that, the whole kit and caboodle. Extraordinarily, devastatingly destructive, but very calculated and timed leaks. He said the Watergate story is the greatest story in the history of civilization for which there was only one source. Think about it.
What's the one source?
Deep Throat.
Yeah, but who is Deep Throat? They keep speculating.
Exactly, that's the problem. That's the thing right there. What he was saying is, and I think other journalists have said it too, but of course they can't say it too out loud because everyone's got to hate Nixon and prove they're a nice guy. What Deep Throat proves is that none of that stuff was verifiable. You're supposed to have two sources. And if you're having a story this big, you'd better have more than two sources. But they went with him. Largely unchecked, largely unverified, over and over again. And the only way you can explain that in terms of journalistic procedure, and remember, one of Nixon's lines was always that the Washington Post is not responsible journalism. And in a technical sense, he's right. It was not responsible journalism because you do not run with an unidentified and unverifiable source, especially for a story that is this big.
See, with Nixon, I'm not saying I'm not defending him and I'm not attacking him.
We
either.
Understand you're not defending Nixon. Okay.
I always thought they targeted him not just because of obviously a lot of his views on things, but mostly just he didn't play any of that Bohemian Grove stuff. To me, that's I know we joke, and I've talked to people who study secret societies, and they're very skeptic when it comes to the secret societies. Actually, they get a lot of crap because people want to know about rituals and all this type of stuff. They kind of tell you what they were able to find out about it, which is making policies and pipelines and things, but it's around this weird fraternity thing. Now, there's a lot of fraternity stuff in that presidency type deal. That's through a lot of presidencies at that. I think it's Skull and Bones Society is a great example. But Nixon, on his famous Nixon tapes, talks about Bohemian Grove, and he says it's the whatever thing that I'm not going to say the word because it's going to offend some people, but he calls it out and says he doesn't like any of that type of stuff. And he was known not to play any of that weird. He thought that was stupid and all this type of stuff. And I figured if that's a way of
can I just stop for a second? Bohemian Grove, that is the place where the
Moloch statue of Algod.
They burn an effigy of a human being.
Well, there's real photos of that. Walter Cronkite played the owl.
Yeah.
So what I was trying to get to is he famous, like that was a conspiracy for a long time until he said it on a Nixon tape, and he was like, it's the bunch of people from San Francisco go there and says a bunch of stuff. I just figured that's like it's not necessarily like have to be some type of ritualistic stuff. I'm sure it's just people that are going and sitting and eating and, talking much like, whatever. But he didn't do that. And that's kind of like being in the club. And we know from Nixon tried to create his own FBI because he couldn't get the FBI to help him out in a certain situation. So he was kind of excluded already. I would add more weight to the argument of
okay, and that's good because I'm glad you brought that up because that's a way of me jumping off, getting back to Oglesby or expanding on Oglesby stuff. If we say, why did Nixon do Watergate? Why did he try to establish his own FBI, establish his own private security state, establish the plumbers, run stuff around and around outside military intelligence, the State Department, we hated, and also the CIA? Why did he alienate all these people? One way of understanding it, apart from his own personal proclivities for paranoia and ultra secrecy, was that, and I've actually run by a couple of people like Peter Dale Scott and a few others, and they're certainly prepared to consider at least the logic of it. Well, maybe not the facticity of it, but the logic of it was that if Nixon and Johnson, as we know, were convinced there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and that it had something to do with trying to normalize relations with Cuba and Russia after the Bay of Pigs and after the missile crisis, then Nixon would have known that if he was to bring about détente, he had to do it secretly. Because what happened when Kennedy tried it? He got whacked. We're talking about what Nixon's state of mind must have been, okay? Kennedy got whacked because he was trying to build détente. Nixon wants to build détente, but he doesn't want to get whacked, obviously. So what does he do? He establishes his own private government within the government and runs it out of the National Security Office in the basement of the White House. And who's the National Security Advisor? Henry Kissinger.
Damn, I never noticed those connections before.
Right?
That's interesting because,
like you said, the Bohemian Grove thing. That I think it's really useful. I mean, not just Bohemian Grove, but more generally, he is, out of all U.S. presidents, he's probably the one who's most out of disfavor with the Yankee establishment. Right? It's true. He was, for good reasons and bad reasons, but he was. Right? Getting to be president under those circumstances is a big deal, and it's hard to pull off, precisely because he is such a complete outlier as far as the Yankee establishment. Okay. And, not to bring this up because we know we have to dislike Donald Trump too, but wasn't one of Trump's big problems the fact that nobody in the establishment of either party actually wanted him there in the first place? Because he really was. Oh, well, we need somebody different. We need to do something different. We need something different. We've got to have some outside people who aren't part of Washington. Well, guess what? You got one. Well, you hate his guts. Okay, so next topic, please. Let's get to somebody who's really a progressive change monger like Joe Biden. Okay, that'll make things better. Okay, but I think we're talking about Nixon. That's what's important. And so I think that
going to Biden isn't good either. I mean, it's just going.
Well, forget it. Okay, so
hang on, we got to talk about it.
No, we're not going to talk about Biden. We're not going to talk about Trump, other than the fact that I know that it's mandatory that when talking in public and you're going to say something political, you got to say, I hate Nixon, I hate Trump. So therefore, please listen to what I say and don't write me off in advance for being a fascist. Okay.
Can I ask you a question? If you think
that, sure.
Do you think Nixon? I believe deep state. If you want to sit in that boat with me, we both don't believe in a two-party system. I think it's ridiculous when you ask the question, "Who'd you vote for?" and someone goes, "I chose the lesser of two evils." I'm like, why does it have to be that? Why? That sounds so nuts to me. But they go, "Oh, the other guy will never win." I'm like, "Yep," because we never try. But when it comes to Nixon, do you think if he would have got in when he was going against Kennedy, if he would have won, I don't think we wouldn't have had the bad history of Nixon that we do, to be 100% honest. I feel like his mentality was fit for the 60s before that new era or that new America thought process started happening that trailed after Kennedy. I mean, it wasn't really fully established, but it was there. And look, I'm not a Kennedy like hardcore fan like a lot of people that research Kennedy are. I'm just kind of looking at his assassination. I'm noticing a lot of problems that are there when it comes to the government. I'm more anti-government, but I also know secrecy is needed. But it's the open door policy I really don't like, which is like when they say national security, it's like label or define your terms. Because when you say national security and then you go, that's the end all. What am I supposed to know? I mean, I asked about to one of the members of the ARRB about the Clinton incident, which is Lee Harvey Oswald got an interview at a mental institution, and one of the members said he couldn't talk about that yet. And I said, why? And it's because it's still in those unreleased documents. So that's not intelligence stuff. That's an interview at a mental institution. So now their word needs to be defined, and also the redaction of names. I get it because, but the whole, if you're going to be a part of a program and you're only going to be a part of it because your name is blacked out, I don't like that. And you probably know you shouldn't be participating in that program unless you want your name published. Then you don't get, these operations probably shouldn't be happening. So that's my viewpoint. Sorry to cut you off. I just feel like I had to
No, that's right. No, that's
because
right.
I'm not a leftist.
Yeah, well, no, well, I wouldn't have thought, but the thing about the redactions is when there was, I forget the exact date, you would know the exact date, but when there was the release of stuff, and so much of the material came back redacted, right? I would say that fits the picture because my sense is what was being redacted, independent of anything that was or was not going on with JFK, Oswald, or Dulles, was a great deal of evidence pointing to a very, very large domestic intelligence or counterintelligence or series of operations, much bigger than we've been aware of, and much more intensive, and beginning much earlier than we ever thought. Okay, this is a true story. Apparently, I heard this that Daniel Ellsberg managed to meet up with Edward Snowden, some undisclosed location in Eastern Europe at one point. And Ellsberg was in a big hurry to talk to Snowden. And they chatted and chatted and chatted and chatted. And there was a journalist who was, well, I'm not going to say her name, but she was going in and out of the room. She was sort of like looking at these guys to make sure the coast was clear the whole time. And she said by the end of it, they were lying next to each other, fully clothed, on the same bed, and they were both looking up at the ceiling. And Snowden was saying, well, they can do this, and they did that. The NSA did this, and now they got this program, they got this cryptogram, and they got this computer. And Ellsberg is just saying, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. They're doing that too. I can't believe it. So then that was like after the year, this sometime during the Obama administration. But I think what that redaction does is that all of this stuff is both bigger, deeper, and longer, been going on much, much longer than I think in general we're aware of. And I think that's what many of those redactions are about in the documents. And if anything else becomes released, they'll be redacted too. And what is inside those blanked out spaces is direct and indirect proof of a number of very large scale domestic spying operations.
How come nobody's thought of an app to fix those redactions? You know what I mean? Like be able to see. We haven't. I've seen some of them. One's like an AI prediction one, but does not get anything right. Like voice to text isn't even good. I don't expect an AI to figure out what a redaction is. But I feel like with technology now, and also the whole redaction method in the first place is a little bit ridiculous too. I mean, that's a big danger with the National Archives and why a lot of researchers don't trust them. And it is that whole transparency and accountability. And I don't think the National Archives are really a problem. I do think that there is some stuff in the archives that is not really released yet. Jack Ruby's X-rays is one. I happen to have it, but it comes from a source that I would call right sometimes, but unreliable in other aspects of things. So you kind of need a more confirmation bias when it comes to like, can anybody openly view this, or do I have to go specifically to your book and then buy the book and then see the document in the book? That's a problem. You need to have it for the public to know about, and it's something I told Larry about, which is making everything public domain. I mean, we live in a world right now where people don't
Larry
trust
Hancock, you mean?
No, Larry Schnapp.
Oh, right.
So Larry Schnapp's part of the lawsuit from the Mary Farrell's site. And it's just about transparency. I mean, there's a whole generation of people that spent their lives researching into the Kennedy assassination specifically and other events in history. But the issue is when you're asking for accountability or transparency in the JFK assassination, you open up the doors for every other political giant mishap for the Watergate to start really busting down. And that's a really big problem because we don't know how many secrets they have behind their walls.
That's right. And like you said, also you use the magic word confirmation bias. You've been working a person is working using their own resources, working on this stuff for years. And somebody inside the security intelligence apparatus decides to leak a document like the MJ12 stuff, remember? Or the alien autopsy stuff, remember that stuff? Just throw it out to the UFO crowd and give them something to start salivating. And you can screw up so much stuff that way. Something that's even partially true.
Well, I mean, even in the
not quite.
An example, all right, explain that, please.
Well, what I mean is that
tell me, they got aliens down there?
Well, no, I'm not going to go into that. But there's a line. Yeah, you ever read the novel The Exorcist?
Hold on, time out. Really your thing just froze on me for a second. Say that again.
Oh, sorry. You ever read the novel The Exorcist?
Yeah.
It's a great metaphysical horror. I'm sorry, I just got my internet connection's unstable, so I may go in and out. Great metaphysical horror novel. And at one point, Father Karras is talking to Father Damien, and he says, "Look, just don't talk to it." And of course, that's why he's ultimately destroyed. Is he's looking for proof for God from a demon, okay, which is like a dumb thing to do, but he can't resist talking to him. Right, part of it too. And he says, yes, but so much of what he says is checked out. And he says, no, it hasn't. It's all lies. But what he will do is he will mix truth with lies to create a bigger lie. Right? So you throw a little bit of truth in to create a bigger deflection.
You're right. I haven't seen that novel.
Okay. Haven't read the novel?
No.
Oh, okay. Anyway, it's a great novel, but you should read it.
We're talking about lies. I just thought I'd be honest.
Oh, okay. That's a step forward. And you probably don't really hate Nixon and Trump as much as you say that. That's okay.
I got to meet him. I don't even know if I hate Hoover. I'd have to meet the guy. I'd be like, what's going on with you, man?
And it's kind of hard to arrange unless, but I don't want to go down that.
Look, I got a magical ball.
Ouija boards screw people up every single time.
That's the real thing. If I was ever going to try one, it would be going to seeing if Lee Harvey Oswald. Just going to ask him some questions. Jesus.
Yeah. So, but basically, if we've got to summarize the Watergate thing as false flag, it was Yankee payback for the cowboy takedown of Kennedy because he was going too far Atlanticist, too far detente, too far pro-Europe, forgetting about Central America and the Pacific Basin, which is the cowboy stomping ground, right? The Yankees had to counter-retaliate by taking down Nixon. They couldn't shoot him, although the Bremer thing is kind of interesting, but they couldn't actually kill him because that was one assassination. They did it through controlled media leaks in two of their central pillars of Yankee establishment power, which are, as we know, New York Times and the Washington Post, who never verified, who totally throw journalistic out the window because they wanted to run with the Deep Throat, right? Or the Deep Throat stories, because we know now there was definitely more than one person. But none of that stuff was vetted properly. None of it. Some of it may have been true. A lot of it may have been true, but it was still improper. It was not agreed upon journalistic practice. And so, again, why? Well, just as there was this insane rush to prove that Oswald acted alone, even if he did, it was still done improperly, illegally, as a matter of fact. Why was there this rush to run with the Deep Throat story, which was unverifiable and was not a certified source with confirmation? Because you wanted to run with it. And why would you want to run with it? Because running with it is the goal. That's the whole idea. You have to run with this because that's the point. Running with it. Why? To bring down the administration.
But it becomes a danger because if we look at the public's kind of perception of the world or politics, it gets skewed and it kind of gets directed in a sense as well, too. I mean, I would go as far as to say that when it comes to certain issues, like, I mean, we talk about TV being brainwashing, but, advertisement companies is a very good example of subliminal messaging and types of that sort. I'm not saying the government's sitting there saying, kill your parents. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just
they don't have to say that.
I'm just saying when it comes to
people want to kill their parents anyway. So
I know. telling you. Uh, but when it comes to, certain media sources that start releasing things or start having a certain slant of things, whether they're in the pocket of the government or not, or they're told to do something. I mean, Kennedy assassination is a great example. I mean, if you post photos out of sequence and make it look like the head does go forward, and you can watch the PBS documentary, it's live for everyone to be able to see. When the guy's explaining the Zapruder film to him, and the guy goes, "Well, to me, the head looks like it goes back." And then the guy goes, "Oh, well, to the untrained eye, it does look like it goes back, but we don't know if Jackie Kennedy had pushed in a reaction, pushed Kennedy back." And I just go, I mean, that's skewing anyone that doesn't, I mean, especially back then, people didn't know their government was really, really bad. I think now we're starting to understand with the amount of social media and the amount of prying and and yes, I believe some of that is disinformation from some other places as well, too, but because we do the same thing in other countries, everyone's messing with everybody. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at the evidence of what they put out there, and then you look at their track record history, for instance, COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party, they sent letters to the leaders' wives and said that your husband is sleeping with teenagers. That's a low shot. That is the lowest thing I've ever heard. It's like a girl from
It's
high
kind of
school.
it's a kick in the crotch, isn't it?
Yes, no pun intended, but literally, yes, it's terrible. And when I go, if that's your government and we have a record and it's been well accepted that they did that and we have the documents to show that, then a lot of this stuff starts to trickle down and make a little bit more sense. Like, could they do this? Could they do that? Is our idea of what we have on history really correct, or are we hearing it from a standpoint to keep their integrity in check? And that is a lot of what goes on. And I point that right back to the intelligence agencies. I mean, I'll ask you this question. It's a little bit off from all the other stuff, but when it comes to Trump having secret documents in his house, and then Biden having secret documents as well, too, I go, when everyone's saying it's like, "Oh, I can't believe he did the same thing," I go, hang on a second. The only time that ever leaks is when your intelligence agencies let that leak. And okay, so you agree with that? Because I told Walter Schaub, who's like a government ethics guy, big, like almost 1 million followers on Twitter, and I brought up the Johnson thing about Johnson getting naked in front of people at press conferences and stuff, and he's like, "That sounds like a conspiracy theory." I go, dude, look at the scandals Johnson had back in the day, and they all just went silent when he became president. Your intelligence agency, your CIA, your FBI, as much as they have other duties, their main duty is also to make sure that you do not have these types of things happen. So when one does break, which means you really pissed off your agency. And I mean, they're not going to let you. I mean, the Trump thing for me with all the documents on the floor, and again, not a Trumper, but I'm saying when the documents are on the floor and it says secret on the top of it and they take a picture, I go, you think the government's going to let you take a fucking picture of their secret documents like that, even for show? And it's like all like someone bumped into it and the fucking things on. I just said, look, you don't have to be a Trump fan. You don't have to be against Trump. You just look at that and say, that would never normally happen when it's something, especially knowing how hard it takes to get confidential files from the FOIA requests or dealing with the Kennedy assassination stuff. Their secrecy is like, there's not going to be an open picture with no redactions on it where it's labeled secret on the top. It's for show. It's the same thing when they come overseas or whatever and they hand somebody a flag because they lost their family member overseas. It's like, well, that was set up. The guy wasn't just sitting there the moment he came home with a camera and take that shot. No, it's for the whole thing. And it's a show. I don't know why the public needs the show, but
Well, I think the reason for that is, if you want to read my book, Spectacle of the False Flag, it's the
I
spectacle part.
can't read.
Yeah, that's why on YouTube. It's Guy Debord, The Society of the Spectacle. And if you read Debord's books on the Society of the Spectacle, he has a great interest in clandestine government activity. What he simply says is that in a thoroughly mediatized political system, which is what we have, even worse back than the 60s and 70s when we wrote this stuff, far worse even today, conspiracy is a necessary part of governance. Because what you have to do to govern in a culture that is addicted to the spectacle is you have to manipulate, I mean, not just try to control, but actively manipulate in a hands-on editorial fashion, the flow of information and the circulation of images. Like, I'll give you a good example. There's a very good documentary on Netflix I watched the other night about the two Spains. It was about the Catalonian secessionist movement and the elections in Catalonia, right? I don't know if you remember, that was a couple of years ago. It looked like Spain was going to blow up because the Catalonians were trying to secede. They had a secessionist government in the state of Catalonia, kind of like the Parti Québécois in Canada. That was that sort of operation thing, right? And when you look at what they were doing, it made no political sense whatsoever. Okay, so here's the thing. Under Catalonian law, for a bill to pass, it needs to have an approval of 90 members, minimum 90 members in the Chamber of Deputies. That's their version of Congress, Chamber of Deputies, right? Now, when they were going to have the vote on the bill proclaiming national independence, the majority bill gets walked out because although the secessionists, the National Independence Party, had the majority of seats, they did not have the plurality of votes. It's a parliamentary system, and you get in a parliamentary system, right? Just like you get in the United States with Trump versus Hillary. The majority of people don't vote for you, but you wind up in power. These are the distribution of seats, right? That's what was looking in Catalonia. The majority of members walk out. They only have about 72 people. 70 vote. 2 people voted against or abstained. They won with 70. Now that, under Catalonian law, is not a valid bill. But then they ran with it. Well, we just voted on it, and it was almost unanimous, so now we're independent. I said, well, no, you're not. You violated your own parliamentary procedures. And they said, well, no, this is different. Law does not cover every conceivable. And this is national independence we're talking about, so we're just going to go with it. Because we did it, right? Okay, and we're the government, right? So we did it, and we got it. Right, okay. So that doesn't work. And then they decide to say, okay, well, maybe the bill isn't enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to go with a referendum. A referendum in Catalonia, so the people themselves can verify what we did improperly with the legislative enactment of the Bill of Independence. So then the Spanish Constitution says, no, you can't do that, because under Spanish law, you cannot run a referendum for these purposes under this. You want to run them, so the referendum is not valid. And they said, oh no, we're going to do the because we're already independent, because we said we are. So we're going to run with a referendum to prove all over again that we're really independent. So what happened is that the Spanish said, no, you cannot. The referendum is illegal. They sent in about 11,000 cops and security people to try to shut down the referendum. They busted into some places, but for the most part, the vote took place. The problem is that only 40% of the population voted. The same 40% that voted for the independence parties, not the 60%. 60% of Catalonians boycotted the referendum because it wasn't valid. And here's the problem. If you show up to vote, even if you're going to vote no, what is it you're doing by voting? You're acknowledging the legitimacy of the procedure, if not the outcome, right? So the anti-independence movement correctly just did an en masse boycott. So they got 99% support for independence from 40% of the electorate. Is that convincing? Is that overpowering? No, but they ran with that one too. And they said, well, that proves it. We got 99% of the referendum. We are independent, damn it, right? So the whole thing became a complete mess. The EU didn't even want to approve it. And it's still in a state of complete abeyance as to what Catalonia's actual status is, both within the European Union. But here's the point I'm getting at. Here's where spectacle comes in. The pro-independence politicians have been asked any number of times, why did you pursue this? I mean, I know you want independence badly, but you could not pull this off politically nor legally. What was your plan? I mean, it was guaranteed the Spanish were not going to approve it, the Spanish constitution were not going to approve it, and the majority of Catalonian voters who are actually against independence were not going to approve it. So why did you so insistently go full throttle on this? And they said, simple, it's democracy. The media was carrying a story of Catalans voting. If you're against us, you're against democracy, because we're the ones who are voting. That's spectacle.
I can tell you one thing is that if someone uses the word
only
democracy,
one thing,
I'm getting gaslit. I'm getting gaslit by the word democracy.
Oh yeah, totally. See, that's the same thing about the Ukraine, isn't it? I saw there was. Oh, I'm so bad with it.
Wait, real quick before you talk about Ukraine, you got to denounce Trump first, and then we talk about.
Okay, I denounced Trump. Okay, and I don't like Putin either. Okay,
now I'm listening.
I denounced those guys. Yeah. Okay, it was Scott Ritter, the big whistleblower in Iraq about the WMDs, right? And I saw an interview with him. It was either Al Jazeera, I think it was Al Jazeera, or maybe it was an independent outfit, but I saw a very good interview with him on YouTube.
Well, damn, do you listen to this show at all? Shit.
Never watched it. Okay. I never heard of it either, but I mean, that's right. I don't even know what I'm doing right now. But anyway, Scott Ritter was having an interview, and it's on YouTube, and they were talking about the Ukraine problem. And what he said is, and Glenn Greenwald has also brought this up on his podcasts, which I think are generally pretty good. And what they both said is, look, okay, so Ukraine's a democracy. That means it's good. Russia is also a democracy, but not the way we want it to be. So therefore, it's bad. Therefore, we are looking at good versus evil. And he said, what everyone has forgotten, among other things, a lot of stuff's been forgotten. One of the things that's been forgotten is that if you look at all of the international committees, bodies that measure levels of corruption and criminality in government, Ukraine was one of the highest scores in the entire world. It scored much higher than Russia in terms of corruption and state criminality. And these are the good guys. Now, you may want the Ukraine to win for a lot of different reasons, partly to try to indirectly force regime change in Russia, and also break up the Russian state so that all of the ex-Soviet republics can be client states of NATO, right? Which is really what this is all about. But just completely forget how, in many ways, repugnant the Zelensky regime is to his Time Magazine Man of the Year award a few months ago, and his adulation in Congress, is that this is a spectacle that's being run. This is democracy versus anti-democracy. There are no sides. There are no two sides of the story here. There's only one side. Managed through subliminally, mimetically, or that whole brainwash gobbledygook we got in our brains about affectivity and performativity and response to images and signals and symbols and hieroglyphs, especially with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of likes. It's a spectacle.
Do you think that we're in an age right now of a second church committee? Like, honestly speaking, like, not talking about political, like any of the Republicans that want to sign up for a whole nother church committee, but like my generation's more of an activist, very active in things of getting things done, I would say, whether it's protests and things of that sort. I'm not harsh in the other generations for what they were able to uncover, but mine has just been able to really stir up some shit to get some.
You mean like Occupy Wall Street?
Well, I mean, that's a good one as well too, but
but where did it go?
It's like a loop. It kind of goes right back to the first step again. I mean, that's an issue with the people, and that happens with us as well too. We protest.
Can I say one thing? Not only I'll tell you something on that very note. Not only do you have to start your conversations, I hate Trump, I hate Nixon, I hate Putin, I hate Zelensky. You also have to say, I love Greta Thunberg.
I do not like her.
You have to.
Why are we taking advice from a 12-year-old?
You're a bad person now.
No,
I can't talk
care.
to you if you're not pro Greta. I mean, there's something wrong with that. She's trying to make things better.
No, she's not. She's 12 years old. She needs to sit. Actually, I think she's older now, but I don't look. Why are people going like she's the I'm like, why? She's just saying like, stop polluting so much. I could easily do that and get 1 million followers, but I'd rather show my feet on Instagram. You know what I mean? Get more views that way. But no, I don't like Greta Thunberg at all. That's funny you mentioned her.
Well, I don't know. You're too much of an extremist.
I'm not an extremist. I don't.
Yeah, you don't like Greta Thunberg. That makes you're
God, really?
You're an extremist, if not a fascist. So,
look, for the love of God, throwing paint on a painting that's sitting in a museum is not a way you want to get shit done. It just makes you look unstable. So why don't you?
But gluing the appendages, the genitalia to the paintings, that's even.
They
better.
Did that?
I think so.
Oh my God, why?
Somewhere somebody did it. I mean,
You mean like fingers, not like I'm thinking.
No.
Oh, the other. Oh.
The
Call it art and sell it for 50 million. I don't know.
The 21st male digit.
I don't know. Maybe we're screwed as people. I don't know. Maybe it's in the water. Do you believe?
No, well, I'll summarize it. I'll encapsulate it this way. When you're talking about politics, and especially within the age of the spectacle, and I think De Boer was right in his essentials about his writings about the society of the spectacle, is that the two things you have to come to terms with are affectivity and performance. I've just gotten to the point where I'm just seeing everything through those lenses. I'm not really paying a lot of attention to the substantive content of what anyone is saying. I'm just trying to figure out how this is playing out on the fields of performance and affect, not effect, affect. Because what we've done is we've come up with we've somehow managed to come up with a new form of political economy in which social capital can be generated by virtue, which means that you can actually afford to go poor, become poor, and yet you're still rich because you recognize as being the right type of person.
Well, like values as in hardworking, if you're probably poor,
No, no,
lower
no, no, no,
class.
no, 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 no. Voting the right way, being the right type of person. We found a way to make virtue pay in terms of social capital.
Well, also, I mean, there's a lot of like what was happening during this last election, which is if you didn't vote Biden, then you must hate America. And it was like, that's a little bit, I think, weird. I mean, I know that the people think that the president has a lot of power, but to be 100% honest, I don't believe he really has anything besides making very cosmetic changes, like gas prices and stuff. I'm sure it impacts all of our lives. I get that. But when it comes to like real, like structural issues, stuff that's been going on for years upon years upon years, longer than any president has ever been in office for, I mean, to me, that's my biggest point when I mention like a deep state, and people kind of just immediately tune out at the talk of it because they start thinking about like where it goes really extreme, which is they're there for world population control and all. And I don't believe that. I just think you can look at things, and in some aspects, I've started to hear a lot of people that I would never thought would speak like that start speaking like that, start saying climate change and all this is world dominant. I don't believe that. But what I do believe is that there's a lot of figures that are found a way to get rich off of a system that they help build. So now they're part of this system. And if you play the game, you get to be in that structural system and you're never going to have to worry. And that is a problem because it puts pressure on the necks of every other person out here that's out here trying to do something, feel like they can. I mean, our success is now limited. If we're doing a YouTube show, if we're doing a podcast, if we're doing this, the social platforms are now your gateway to success. And if you're not cranking out as much content as you possibly can to get to whatever your fingers work to the bone, then they're going to go to the other person that's doing what they want done. I mean, there's plenty of channels out there that just talk about Greta Thunberg, how amazing she is. And do I think the companies that run these things really believe that? No, but they know what people want to hear and what the public is kind of crying out for. I mean, there's a lot of that. I could make videos of ASMR, I could do whatever and get way more hits. But
Well,
it's
I think if you really wanted to come up with some subversive episodes on your show, what you should be looking at is the issue of what you should be looking at if you really want to hit the stratospheric heights in terms of your ratings. What you really want to be focusing on is degrowth.
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 Explain.
That's the hidden motor of green politics, is degrowth, coordinated shrinkage of the economy.
You got to give me some examples.
I'm going to keep it very broad, but look at the Fourth Industrial Revolution by Schwab and look at all the Davos public posturing statements and look at everything that Justin Trudeau has ever said about anything. And you'll get there eventually. I'm just tossing it out there. But really, I think what we're really doing is the Fourth Industrial Revolution requires a collective, I don't want to say disempowering exactly, but shall we say a de-instrumentalizing of a great deal of traditional sectors of economic and social productivity, which are industrial, white collar, and regular full-time employment. And a lot of this is being rationalized under a green rubric of spectacle, a green spectacle, or I should say spectacle of greenness.
I mean, I believe that obviously when a situation happens, the government tries to find a way to use it to their advantage. And I think that's great examples. I think when people talk about like our anti-climate change or they say that the government's lying, I was like, I mean, they have some points when it comes into what they choose. I mean, they do that with reporting all the time. Like I could tell you, for an example, that if we had two incidences happen, and I'm not going to say the COVID topic, but if there's two incidences that happen and you report and you don't have any evidence on either one, and you report that there's no evidence that this plot, but then you leave out the other one, you're targeting that one on purpose. And I only know that, and that's because of the COVID thing about the whole lab and all that as well too. They didn't have evidence on the market theory either. They didn't have evidence on anything, but they just said the lab thing, no evidence on that. And for me, that was like, well, you could say the same shit about the other one, but now you're going to warp the public into two different groups now. People that say that if you believe it's a lab, you're right wing and all that type of stuff, when you can't even ask the question anymore. And that's why I bring back like the dangers of the CCP. I mean, a lot of stuff happened when all the lab stuff broke down. I mean, we were getting our masks from China, and they said, we're going to stop making you masks. And we realized, oh shit, we need to start making our own masks. They had mask factories already. So you get into this position of like, okay, now they're leveraging. It's not the world working together anymore. It's now countries, and you start to see the business start to seep through. And I mean, it's a lot of this type of stuff, which is division, and it gets labeling of things as well too. I mean, they called Nike racist because Nike asked a question of like, are you paying the workers a reasonable wage for the shoes that they're making for us? They just wanted to know. And that's when the basketball player, the guy that got banned from the NBA, had the Free Uyghur shirt on. He wanted people to be aware of it. And China was like, you either take him out or we're not playing the NBA up here. And that's 45% of their market. They're kind of fucked. So there's a lot of like this, like they even criticize, and it's on YouTube. You can find it as well too. The main leader was criticizing I forgot who it was, one of the representatives, because of all the George Floyd stuff. He's like, why are they doing that? And it's like, okay, so they realized we had a woke movement, we had this all type of stuff, and they capitalized on that. And that's not just their government, that's every government. Whenever there's an issue, they find a way that they can use it to their advantage. It's kind of like the best of a bad scenario type deal. If they have riots, if they have all this stuff, they start using it to their advantage. They go, how can we twist this? How can we either, in their eyes, it's kind of turning it down, like trying to de-escalate, but it's not that.
UBC's.
I can't, you got to say that again.
Oh, sorry. One of my former law profs when I was at UBC, go back, and he's come out a couple of documentaries about what corporation, which he runs a very well. Basically, he makes a category error, but anyway, a documentary about the fact that the corporation is basically. But he's done some stuff on whistleblowing green or woke capitalism. And he says it can't. When he says this is an impossible thing, it is an impossible category. You cannot have woke capitalism. You can have capitalism that's investing in green technologies, which we definitely have, but you cannot have a woke capitalism, because the essence of wokeness is a degree of social egalitarianism that capitalism is inherently antithetical to. I'm not going to take a sign on that. I just would recommend you can check out some of this stuff. This is actually pretty good. Again, I don't really agree with it, especially with the corporation, because, like I said, he makes a category error. You cannot use a human being, a human psyche, as a valid analogy or metaphor for a corporate information processing complex. It's just not the same thing. But I mean, it's very pejorative and it's very moralistic.
I just scoff whenever I see Disney or Chick-fil-A is the only company that didn't do it, but they switched their logo to a rainbow flag, expecting like we actually believe that they care. They more just want to get people to go buy their shit. I mean, Chick-fil-A is the only one that stood strong on that. I don't agree with Chick-fil-A's values at all, but damn it. I mean, half the people that were tweeting about Chick-fil-A were still going to Chick-fil-A and getting their sandwiches. So it's like, I look at people like as
I've never had it. Are they good?
Chick-fil-A?
Yeah, I've never been.
I had it when I was back in like high school. Last time I had
okay.
like fast food, but it was pretty good. Chicken sandwich,
Okay.
spicy chicken.
We got Popeyes up here now.
That's fantastic.
I like Popeyes. I think Popeyes is okay. I first had it when I was at the International Airport in Hong Kong. That's where I have my first Popeyes meal, and I said this actually isn't too bad.
It's really good. Their biscuits are amazing.
They are good, and most of the CCP story, the China story, really bothers me, and it really gets to me, and it's actually made me very, very depressed many times in my life last few years. Is that they destroyed Star Wars?
How so?
Well, the third trilogy, what happens next, as opposed to what happened before the third trilogy. The one that Lucas didn't have anything to do with, because Walt Disney bought the rights and then kept him out of the creative process for the last 3 films.
I've only seen the prequels.
Oh, well, yeah, that's bad enough, but don't see the sequels, because what happened was that they knew the big market was going to be China. China was going to make or break the financial success of the third trilogy, that series. So what they decided to do was basically retell the middle trilogy, which is all it is. It's a repeat of the second trilogy, with some cosmetic differences.
Is that the
That's
one
it.
Ray and all them?
Yeah, that's it. That's what they've done. They
I haven't
just
seen those.
retold the whole story. I said, okay, they're going to do it for the first one because it kind of makes sense, sort of, kind of, to tell a story like that for the first one. But the next two, they're totally point. I mean, none of this stuff makes sense anyway, really. But even by cinematic standards, it is worse than useless. Because all it is, it's remaking episodes 4, 5, and 6 3 times each. And
After I,
it was done to keep the Chinese to make an impact on China. Because you see, the Chinese didn't have the first 2 trilogies, right? This was going to be their first Star Wars films to watch. So they said, I know what we'll do. We'll tell everybody in China second trilogy story all over again.
they don't care about us anymore.
Yeah, no, they not at all.
That sucks.
Yeah,
Especially
it
if you're,
does.
I mean, but most of the anime comes from like overseas as well too. But I'm happy with
Well,
that
that's
as
true.
long as they make English versions because I can't
Yeah, of
stand
course,
reading subtitles.
the Squid Game came from South Korea, so that's a positive.
They're making a second one. I'm stoked for that.
Yeah, I know that the Squid Game is great.
Okay. Well, Eric, we've talked plenty enough, man. And I appreciate the time you gave me to come back on the show and talk as well, too. I enjoy talking with you, man. But real quick, before you sign off and you let everybody know your links and everything, can you denounce Trump one more time for me just so I can believe you?
Okay, I'm gonna say this. I denounce Donald Trump. Okay, I don't think he's the Antichrist, as a friend of mine genuinely believes. Honestly believes he's the Antichrist. I wouldn't go quite that far, but I do not like Donald Trump. But I do like a guy who also many people despise is James Elroy. And my publisher asked me to push my book when I came on to you again. So yeah, be sure to get my book published by Punctum Press. The View from Howard's Fuckpad, James Elroy, Bad White Men, the Deep State, and the Weird Noir of James Elroy. Coming out next couple months.
Did your publisher like the podcast episode?
They flogged it, yeah. They prostituted us.
All right,
yeah,
great.
It was done well.
Fantastic. And real quick, what about Dick Cheney? You like Dick Cheney? That man shot a guy in the head hunting quail, and quail are like a foot fucking tall.
Yeah, I think that was an accident.
You got to punt that thing up in the air to get it. You know. All right.
Yeah,
well,
that's true. Okay.
I'll
on that note, I'll let you go.
Okay. I'll leave you on a cliffhanger. But everybody, thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Eric, thanks again for joining me. I'll make sure your links are in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.